History is often described as a collection of great minds, bold leaders, and brilliant breakthroughs. And that's true, right up until the exact moment someone in charge says, "No, I've got this," ignores everyone in the room, and presses the red button anyway. Because for every masterpiece in history, there's also a decision that makes you pause and think, surely, someone warned them. And almost every time, someone did. These are not stories about people who didn't know better. These are stories about people who absolutely knew better and then confidently did the opposite. People with advisors, data, maps, reports, backup plans, and still somehow, the worst option won the vote inside their own head. Sometimes the decision was made out of pride, sometimes boredom, sometimes blind confidence built from years of getting away with things. In a few cases, it was made simply because nobody wanted to be the person who said, "This is a terrible idea." History was written anyway, in permanent ink. What followed wasn't subtle. Empires shrank, cities burned, economies collapsed. Millions of people paid the price for a moment that could have been avoided by reading one more page, waiting one more day, or listening to one person in the room who quietly said, "Maybe don't." Tonight, we're not ranking intelligence. We're not diagnosing character flaws. We're reopening the files on decisions so bad they outlived the people who made them. Choices that turned authority into embarrassment and confidence into a historical punchline. Because history doesn't remember how smart you were. It remembers the one time you were spectacularly wrong. 1. The moment Napoleon decided Russia would surrender before winter had a say. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was not short on confidence. He had redrawn maps, crushed coalitions, and turned Europe into a scoreboard with his name on top. When he looked east toward Russia, he wasn't thinking about snow, distance, or supply lines. He was thinking about momentum. Empires, in his experience, collapsed once you walked into their capital with enough confidence and cannons. The warnings were not subtle. Advisors pointed out the size of Russia. Generals mentioned logistics. Maps existed. Winter had a reputation. None of this was new information. Napoleon acknowledged the concerns, and then ignored them. His plan assumed Russia would fight a decisive battle, lose, and negotiate. It was a neat plan. It just relied on Russia cooperating. Instead, the Russian army retreated. Towns were abandoned. Supplies disappeared. Napoleon marched deeper, convinced that one more push would force surrender. Each step forward made retreat harder. Each delay made the weather less forgiving. Still, the decision did not change. By the time the French army reached Moscow, the city was largely empty and soon on fire. There was no surrender, no negotiation, just silence, smoke, and winter approaching on schedule. Napoleon waited. Winter did not. What followed was not a dramatic defeat, but a slow collapse. Food vanished, horses died, soldiers froze, discipline eroded. Retreat turned into survival. Of the more than 600,000 troops who began the campaign, a fraction returned. The Grande Armée didn't lose a single decisive battle. It simply ran out of time, warmth, and options. At no point was this outcome unpredictable. The mistake wasn't invading Russia. It was believing Russia would behave conveniently. Napoleon didn't lack intelligence. He lacked restraint at the exact moment restraint mattered. The idiocy was not arrogance in general. It was choosing speed over reality, assuming winter would wait, and discovering that seasons do not negotiate. 2. The moment Christopher Columbus decided the world would match his math instead of reality. Christopher Columbus did not set out to prove the Earth was round. Educated Europeans already knew that. His gamble was different, and far worse. He believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. Multiple scholars told him so. Multiple navigators warned him that his distance calculations were wrong. Columbus reviewed the objections, disagreed with them, and chose numbers he liked better. His plan relied on Asia being much closer than it was. Supplies were calculated based on those assumptions. Crew morale depended on those assumptions. There was no backup plan if the ocean didn't politely end where his math said it should. As the voyage dragged on, reality began pushing back. Weeks passed. Land didn't appear. Food ran low. Crew members talked openly about mutiny. Columbus responded by adjusting expectations, not calculations. He reassured the crew that land was just ahead, repeatedly moving the goalpost forward. When land finally appeared, it wasn't Asia. It wasn't even close. Columbus reached the Caribbean and immediately decided it had to be Asia anyway. Instead of correcting the error, he doubled down. He renamed locations, misidentified people, and forced the new world to fit his original mistake. This decision didn't end with embarrassment. It created centuries of confusion, exploitation, and catastrophic misunderstanding. Columbus returned home claiming success, not because he was right, but because admitting error would have ended his career. The idiocy was not sailing west. It was refusing to update reality when reality arrived, choosing to protect bad math instead of correcting it. 3. The moment Thomas Midgley Jr. fixed one problem by inventing several worse ones. Thomas Midgley Jr. was not incompetent. He was brilliant. Unfortunately, he used that brilliance to solve problems without asking whether the solutions were survivable. First came leaded gasoline. Engines were knocking. Midgley proposed adding tetraethyl lead. It worked beautifully, mechanically. Doctors warned him. Scientists warned him. Lead poisoning was already well documented. Midgley publicly dismissed the concerns. To prove safety, he inhaled leaded gasoline vapors on stage and washed his hands in it. He fell ill shortly afterward but continued promoting the product. Then came his second contribution, CFCs. Refrigerants were toxic or flammable. Midgley developed chlorofluorocarbons, stable, non-toxic, and miraculous. Again, it worked. Again, no one asked what would happen long-term. Decades later, leaded gasoline poisoned entire populations. CFCs destroyed the ozone layer. Midgley himself later contracted polio and invented a system of ropes and pulleys to lift himself out of bed. He died tangled in his own invention. Historians now credit Midgley with causing more environmental damage than any other single human in history, not through malice, but through unchecked confidence. The idiocy was not inventing solutions. It was solving problems in isolation, never asking what those solutions would do once released into the world. 4. The moment Mao Zedong declared war on sparrows. In the late 1950s, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize China. Part of that plan involved identifying enemies of agricultural productivity. One of those enemies, Mao decided, was the sparrow. Sparrows ate grain. Grain shortages existed. The logic felt clean. Experts warned him. Ecologists objected. Mao ignored them. A nationwide campaign began. Citizens were ordered to kill sparrows by any means necessary. People banged pots to keep birds airborne until they collapsed from exhaustion. Nests were destroyed. Millions of sparrows died. At first, crop yields appeared to improve. Then the insects arrived. Sparrows had been controlling locust populations. Without them, insects exploded. Crops were devastated. Famine followed. Tens of millions died. The sparrow was later quietly removed from the enemy list. The idiocy was not targeting pests. It was simplifying an ecosystem into a slogan and discovering too late that nature does not accept single variable solutions. 5. The moment Adolf Hitler decided drugs would fix leadership fatigue. As World War II dragged on, Hitler's health declined. Instead of rest or delegation, his physician began administering increasing doses of stimulants, sedatives, and experimental compounds. Methamphetamine was routine. So were opioids and hormones. Staff noticed changes. Decision-making became erratic. Mood swings intensified. Paranoia deepened. Military advisors presented increasingly dire reports. Hitler responded with denial, fantasy strategies, and orders disconnected from reality. The drugs didn't create the ideology, but they amplified impulsiveness at the worst possible time. Retreats were forbidden. Armies were ordered to hold impossible positions. Reality was replaced with belief. Germany collapsed anyway. The idiocy was not substance use. It was medicating power instead of questioning it, treating exhaustion as a chemical problem rather than a strategic warning. 6. The moment Chernobyl plant managers decided safety rules were optional during an experiment. On the night of April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was not facing an emergency. It was running a test. The goal was simple: see whether the turbines could generate enough power during a shutdown to keep systems running briefly. The test had been postponed multiple times. Pressure existed to finally complete it. What followed was not a lack of rules. It was an abundance of them, systematically ignored. Operators disabled automatic shutdown mechanisms. Safety protocols were overridden. Warning signs appeared and were dismissed. Reactor conditions drifted far outside safe parameters. At each step, the system attempted to protect itself. At each step, humans manually prevented it from doing so. Why? Because stopping the test would have meant admitting failure, delaying approval, and explaining why deadlines weren't met. Continuing felt easier, until it wasn't. The reactor became unstable. Power surged. Control rods were inserted too late, triggering a catastrophic reaction. The explosion that followed tore the reactor apart, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material across Europe. The disaster was not caused by ignorance. Engineers understood nuclear physics. Manuals existed. Training was thorough. The fatal decision was treating safeguards as obstacles rather than boundaries. The idiocy was not running a risky experiment. It was deliberately disabling every system designed to stop disaster, then acting surprised when nothing stopped it. 7. The moment Julius Caesar ignored multiple warnings and showed up anyway. By 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was aware that people wanted him dead. He had been warned repeatedly. Friends advised caution. His wife reportedly dreamed of his assassination. A written warning was handed to him on the day itself. Caesar read none of it. He walked into the Senate unarmed, dismissing concerns as superstition and exaggeration. Authority had insulated him for years. He believed his status protected him better than any guard. It didn't. Surrounded by senators, Caesar was stabbed repeatedly. Power evaporated instantly. Rome descended into chaos. The Republic collapsed into civil war. This was not unpredictability. The threat was public, the tension obvious. The mistake was assuming reputation replaces precaution. The idiocy was not trusting people. It was mistaking political dominance for physical immunity. 8. The moment Tsar Nicholas II decided to personally lead the army without knowing how. During World War I, Russia was struggling. Morale was low. Losses were heavy. Nicholas II believed the solution was symbolic leadership. He dismissed experienced generals and placed himself in command. Nicholas had no military training. None. Strategy meetings became ceremonial. Decisions slowed. Command structures fractured. Meanwhile, back home, the government collapsed without him. Food shortages worsened. Protests spread. Revolution ignited. By the time Nicholas realized his absence mattered more than his presence, it was too late. He lost the war, the throne, and eventually his life. The idiocy was not caring about morale. It was assuming authority substitutes for competence. 9. The moment Herbert Hoover decided the Great Depression would fix itself. When the U.S. economy collapsed in 1929, Hoover believed government intervention would make things worse. Markets, he argued, should correct naturally. Relief was discouraged, action was delayed. Unemployment soared, banks failed, poverty spread, public anger grew. Hoover maintained optimism long after evidence demanded action. His restraint became a symbol of detachment. By the time policies shifted, trust was gone. The idiocy was not caution. It was mistaking ideology for adaptability while people starved. 10. The moment Galloping Gertie engineers assumed wind would behave politely. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was elegant, lightweight, and modern. Engineers prioritized cost and aesthetics. Wind behavior was discussed and dismissed. When the bridge began oscillating dramatically, engineers filmed it instead of closing it. They assumed the structure could handle it. It couldn't. The bridge tore itself apart in dramatic fashion, collapsing into the water below just months after opening. The idiocy was not innovation. It was assuming physics would cooperate because the math looked fine on paper. 11. The moment French military leadership decided the next war would politely resemble the last one. After World War I, France had a trauma problem. Millions dead, cities destroyed, and a single conclusion carved into military thinking: never let Germany invade directly again. The solution was the Maginot Line, a massive system of concrete fortifications, bunkers, artillery, and underground railways stretching along the German border. It was expensive, it was technologically impressive, and it was built to stop the exact same war from happening twice. Warnings existed. Military strategists pointed out the obvious. Germany might not attack the strongest point. Tanks were evolving. Air power was changing warfare. The Ardennes forest, lightly defended, remained an open question. French planners acknowledged these concerns and filed them away. Confidence replaced flexibility. The Maginot Line became psychological armor. Politicians reassured the public. Generals trusted the concrete. When World War II began, Germany simply went around it, pushing through Belgium and the Ardennes with speed France was unprepared for. French defenses collapsed in weeks. The fortifications remained intact, perfectly functional and strategically irrelevant. The war France prepared for never arrived. A different one did. The idiocy was not building defenses, it was preparing perfectly for the wrong future and assuming history would cooperate. 12. The moment Spanish conquistadors decided disease didn't count as a variable. When Spanish forces arrived in the Americas, military encounters were brutal but limited. What truly reshaped the continent wasn't strategy or steel, it was smallpox. Indigenous populations had no immunity. Disease spread faster than any army. The mistake came later. Spanish administrators noticed depopulation but failed to understand its scale or implications. Labor systems were maintained as if populations were stable. Tribute demands remained unchanged. Entire economic structures were built on numbers that no longer existed. Collapse followed. Agricultural systems failed. Supply chains broke. Revolts increased. The colonial machine strained under assumptions disconnected from reality. The idiocy was not conquest. It was ignoring biology while trying to manage an empire with fantasy math. 13. The moment stock market investors decided leverage meant free money forever. In the 1920s, buying stocks on margin became normal. Investors borrowed heavily to invest more. Prices rose. Everyone felt smart. Warnings existed, quietly at first. Economists cautioned about bubbles. Regulators hesitated. The assumption was simple: markets always go up. When prices began to wobble, investors doubled down. Margin calls followed. Forced selling triggered panic. Panic triggered collapse. The Great Depression followed. The idiocy was not speculation. It was believing debt disappears when confidence is high enough. 14. The moment NASA managers decided schedule pressure outweighed physics. On January 28, 1986, engineers warned that cold temperatures could cause O-ring failure on the Space Shuttle Challenger. Data existed. Past anomalies were documented. Concerns were explicitly raised. Management debated. Schedules mattered. Public expectation mattered. The launch proceeded. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger disintegrated. Investigations later showed the disaster wasn't technical ignorance. It was organizational normalization of risk. Warnings became background noise. The idiocy was not ambition. It was treating repeated warnings as proof of safety. 15. The moment Easter Island Society decided the last tree could wait. Easter Island was once forested. Trees supported canoes, housing, and food production. As statues grew larger, trees were cut faster. Some warned. Others benefited. By the time the last tree fell, it was already too late. Soil eroded, fishing collapsed, society fractured. There was no dramatic decision, just delay after delay. The idiocy was not monument building, it was postponing limits until nature enforced them permanently. 16. The moment British colonial officials decided releasing rabbits would be harmless. In 1859, a British settler in Australia released 24 European rabbits into the wild for hunting. The idea was casual. Rabbits were familiar. They existed elsewhere. No one ran environmental impact studies. No one imagined exponential growth. The assumption was simple: nature would handle it. Nature did not. Australia had no natural predators for rabbits. The climate was ideal. Within decades, rabbits numbered in the hundreds of millions. They devoured vegetation, destroyed crops, accelerated soil erosion, and destabilized entire ecosystems. Attempts to control them escalated from fencing to poison to biological warfare. The infamous rabbit-proof fence stretched thousands of kilometers and failed. Later, viruses were released. They worked briefly. Then rabbits evolved resistance. The problem never went away. The idiocy was not importing animals. It was assuming ecosystems behaved politely when introduced to unchecked reproduction. 17. The moment Soviet planners decided rivers were optional. The Aral Sea was once one of the largest lakes in the world. Soviet planners wanted cotton. Cotton required water. The solution was straightforward: divert the rivers feeding the sea. Warnings existed. Scientists predicted ecological collapse. Planners acknowledged them and proceeded anyway. Production targets mattered more than geography. Over decades, the sea shrank. Salinity rose. Fish died. Fishing communities collapsed. Toxic dust storms spread across the region, carrying pesticide residue. What remained was a desert, littered with rusting ships. The idiocy was not irrigation. It was treating a sea as an inconvenience instead of a system. 18. The moment King Charles XII repeated Napoleon's mistake a century earlier. In 1708, Charles XII of Sweden decided to invade Russia. He was young, undefeated, and confident. Advisors warned him about distance, supply lines, and winter. He ignored them. The Russian army retreated, burned supplies, and waited. Winter arrived. The Swedish army starved and froze. At Poltava, they were decisively defeated. Sweden ceased to be a great power. The idiocy was not invasion. It was learning nothing from geography or history. 19. The moment Ford Motor Company decided hype could replace demand. In the 1950s, Ford spent massive sums marketing the Edsel before anyone saw it. It was framed as revolutionary. Expectations soared. The car arrived, overpriced, underwhelming, and poorly designed. Customers rejected it. Dealers were stuck. Ford lost hundreds of millions. The Edsel became shorthand for failure. The idiocy was not innovation. It was selling a miracle nobody asked for. 20. The moment French generals decided offense would solve everything. French military doctrine before World War II emphasized aggressive offense. Defensive warnings were ignored. Coordination lagged. When Germany attacked, French forces responded with outdated assumptions. The result was collapse. The idiocy was not bravery. It was confusing doctrine with reality. 21. The moment Nero decided a burning city was a branding opportunity. When the Great Fire of Rome erupted in 64 CE, the immediate priority should have been coordination, relief, and containment. Rome was dense, flammable, and chaotic. Fire spread quickly. Panic followed. Leadership mattered. Instead, accounts describe an emperor more focused on optics than logistics. Nero was warned early. He returned to the city, but his actions centered on performance, appearing publicly, delivering theatrical gestures, and, according to multiple sources, indulging in spectacle while neighborhoods burned. Whether he literally played music is debated. What isn't is the vacuum of effective response. Relief efforts lagged, organization faltered, rumors filled the gap. To redirect anger, blame was assigned to a convenient target. Persecution followed. Rebuilding plans emphasized grandeur over safety. Wider streets came later, but only after damage had already rewritten the city. The fire became less a natural disaster than a lesson in what happens when leadership confuses symbolism with action. The idiocy was not vanity. It was mistaking performance for governance during a crisis that demanded logistics. 22. The moment King Louis XVI chose indecision as a strategy. As France slid toward revolution, information was abundant. Finances were collapsing. Food prices were rising. Advisors warned of unrest. Reforms were proposed. Each option carried risk, but delay carried certainty. Louis XVI hesitated. He convened assemblies, dismissed them, reinstated them, and reversed positions repeatedly. Each reversal eroded trust. Each pause emboldened opposition. Attempts at reform arrived late and half-formed. When decisive action finally came, it was interpreted as weakness or betrayal. The monarchy's authority dissolved not in a single act, but through accumulated hesitation. By the time force was considered, legitimacy was gone. The revolution didn't erupt because options were absent. It erupted because none were chosen in time. The idiocy was not caution. It was treating indecision as neutrality, while momentum chose sides. 23. The moment Captain Edward Smith decided speed mattered more than warnings. In April 1912, the Titanic received multiple iceberg warnings. Routes were known. Conditions were clear. Speed could have been reduced. Lookouts could have been adjusted. None of this required innovation, just restraint. The ship maintained near maximum speed. Lookouts lacked binoculars. When the iceberg appeared, there was no margin. The collision was brief. The consequences were not. Evacuation revealed another layer of decision failure. Lifeboats were launched half full. Drills were incomplete. Procedures assumed problems wouldn't occur. They did. The idiocy was not building a ship. It was treating improbability as impossibility. 24. The moment Lehman Brothers executives decided leverage was a personality trait. Leading up to 2008, warnings about subprime exposure were explicit. Risk models showed fragility. Regulators raised concerns. Executives acknowledged them and increased leverage anyway. Short-term profits rewarded risk-taking. Dissent was sidelined. Hedging was inadequate. When markets turned, liquidity vanished. Confidence evaporated. Lehman collapsed, triggering global fallout. The failure wasn't ignorance of risk. It was the belief that scale and reputation could outpace consequences. The idiocy was not ambition. It was assuming size creates immunity. 25. The moment Facebook decided growth could outrun responsibility. As Facebook scaled, internal research flagged misinformation, polarization, and harm. Tools existed to slow spread. Decisions favored engagement metrics instead. Interventions were partial and delayed. Consequences followed. Elections influenced. Trust eroded. Regulatory scrutiny intensified. Adjustments came after damage, not before. The idiocy was not building a platform. It was treating downstream effects as optional, while upstream incentives stayed untouched. 26. The moment Pol Pot decided society would work better without cities. When Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge seized control of Cambodia in 1975, the country was damaged by war but functional. Cities existed. Infrastructure existed. Doctors, teachers, engineers, and administrators existed. Pol Pot looked at all of it and concluded the problem was modernity itself. The plan was radical simplicity. Cities were emptied at gunpoint. Millions were forced into the countryside within days. Hospitals were abandoned, schools closed, currency was eliminated, glasses became suspicious, education became a liability. The country would restart as an agrarian utopia. Warnings were immediate and obvious. Crops could not support the population. Medical care vanished overnight. Administrative systems collapsed. People began dying, not as an unintended side effect, but as a predictable outcome. Instead of reversing course, the regime escalated. Starvation was blamed on sabotage. Dissent was treated as treason. Execution became policy. The system fed on its own failure. By the time the experiment ended, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population was dead. The idiocy was not radical change. It was treating complexity as corruption and discovering too late that simplicity kills at scale. 27. The moment Captain Francesco Scatino decided a cruise ship was a stage. In 2012, the Costa Concordia sailed close to shore to perform a salute maneuver, an unofficial tradition meant to impress onlookers. Navigation systems warned of danger. Charts were clear. The maneuver was unnecessary. The ship struck rocks, water flooded compartments, power failed, confusion spread. The captain delayed evacuation, minimized damage, and abandoned ship while passengers were still aboard. 32 people died. The escalation wasn't the collision, it was denial afterward. Each delay worsened the outcome. Each attempt to protect reputation increased casualties. The idiocy was not error. It was prioritizing image over response once failure occurred. 28. The moment Enron executives decided complexity could hide reality forever. Enron didn't collapse because of one bad deal. It collapsed because leadership built an accounting labyrinth designed to obscure losses. Warnings came from analysts, journalists, and internal whistleblowers. Instead of simplifying, Enron added layers. Instead of transparency, it rewarded confusion. Profits were reported. Cash wasn't there. When confidence cracked, the structure imploded. Employees lost jobs. Pensions vanished. Markets shook. The idiocy was not financial engineering. It was believing opacity is a substitute for solvency. 29. The moment British military leadership followed an order nobody understood. In 1854, during the Crimean War, a vague order was issued to attack. Commanders misinterpreted it. Clarification was possible. It was not requested. Cavalry charged directly into artillery fire. Casualties were immediate. Survivors were confused. The order achieved nothing. The mistake wasn't bravery. It was obedience without verification. The idiocy was not courage. It was acting on ambiguity at full speed. 30. The moment Blockbuster decided late fees mattered more than the future. Blockbuster dominated home entertainment. Netflix approached with a partnership proposal. Streaming was dismissed. Late fees were profitable. Technology advanced. Consumer behavior changed. Blockbuster doubled down on stores and penalties. By the time pivoting was considered, it was too late. The idiocy was not missing innovation. It was monetizing inconvenience and assuming customers would tolerate it forever. 31. The moment King Leopold II decided cruelty could scale without consequences. When King Leopold II took control of the Congo Free State in the late 19th century, it was framed as a humanitarian mission, civilization, trade, progress. On paper, it looked benevolent. In practice, it was an extraction machine powered by terror. Rubber quotas were imposed. Villages were punished for falling short. Violence became policy. Warnings existed almost immediately. Missionaries reported atrocities. Journalists documented amputations. Diplomats raised concerns. Leopold dismissed them all as exaggeration or foreign interference. The system, after all, was profitable. As profits grew, brutality escalated. Enforcement intensified. Punishments became more extreme to maintain output. What began as exploitation hardened into mass atrocity. Millions died. International outrage eventually forced intervention, but only after irreversible damage. Leopold lost the colony, not because the system failed economically, but because it became impossible to deny morally. The idiocy was not greed. It was believing a system built on terror could remain invisible forever. 32. The moment Neville Chamberlain decided paper promises were a defense strategy. In 1938, Europe stood on the brink of war. Germany had violated treaties repeatedly. Military intelligence warned of expansionist intent. Allies urged caution. Chamberlain chose negotiation. The Munich Agreement promised peace for our time. Territory was conceded. Hitler signed. Crowds celebrated. Chamberlain returned home confident he had prevented war. Within months, Germany invaded again. The escalation was subtle but devastating. Each concession emboldened further aggression. Each delay reduced preparedness. When war finally came, Britain faced it from a weaker position. The idiocy was not diplomacy. It was mistaking delay for deterrence. 33. The moment United States military decided plausible deniability could replace planning. The Bay of Pigs invasion was designed to look unofficial. Cuban exiles would invade. The US would deny involvement. The assumption was that success would justify secrecy. Warnings were explicit. Intelligence questioned feasibility. Air support was limited to maintain deniability. Logistics were thin. Escape plans were non-existent. The invasion failed within days. Invaders were captured. US involvement was obvious anyway. The idiocy was not intervention. It was designing failure to preserve appearances. 34. The moment Japanese military command decided shock would end resistance. The attack on Pearl Harbor was tactically effective. Strategically, it was catastrophic. Japanese planners assumed the shock would force negotiation. They underestimated American industrial capacity and resolve. Warnings existed. Analysts cautioned that prolonged war favored the US. The decision proceeded anyway. The escalation led to total war, nuclear devastation, and surrender. The idiocy was not surprise. It was assuming. Initial success equals final outcome. 35. The moment Yahoo decided indecision was safer than commitment. Yahoo had search, email, media. Google offered acquisition. Facebook offered partnership. Each time, leadership hesitated. Strategies shifted. Focus dissolved. Opportunities passed. Relevance faded. The company survived, but as a shadow. The idiocy was not missing one deal. It was refusing to choose a future. 36. The moment Robert Falcon Scott decided tradition mattered more than evidence. In the race to the South Pole, information was not scarce. By the early 1900s, explorers had learned hard lessons about polar travel. Dogs worked. Skis worked. Lightweight logistics mattered. Roald Amundsen adopted all of it. Robert Falcon Scott did not. Scott favored ponies over dogs, hauling over delegation, and tradition over adaptation. Advisors warned him. Previous expeditions had documented failures. Scott acknowledged the data and proceeded with familiar methods anyway. The decision wasn't ideological. It was cultural. He trusted British practice more than uncomfortable evidence. As conditions worsened, the weaknesses compounded. Ponies failed in extreme cold. Human hauling drained energy. Supplies thinned. Each choice narrowed margins. When Scott finally reached the pole, he discovered Amundsen had already been there and left weeks earlier. The return journey became a slow arithmetic of depletion. Food ran out. Weather closed in. Rescue windows closed. Scott and his team died within miles of a supply depot. The idiocy was not bravery. It was choosing comfort with tradition over proof that another method worked better. 37. The moment Boeing decided software could outrun culture. When Boeing rushed the 737 MAX to compete with Airbus, time mattered, certification mattered, market share mattered. Engineers raised concerns about MCAS, a software system that could override pilot input. Training requirements were minimized to speed approvals. Warnings were logged. Simulations flagged edge cases. Decisions prioritized schedule. After the first crash, explanations focused on pilot error. After the second, the pattern became undeniable. 2 planes crashed. Hundreds died. Groundings followed. Investigations revealed a chain of choices where each shortcut assumed the next layer would compensate. The idiocy was not using software. It was assuming organizational pressure could be patched with code. 38. The moment General Douglas MacArthur decided escalation was a personality trait. During the Korean War, early success bred confidence. Warnings about Chinese intervention were explicit. Intelligence suggested limits. MacArthur dismissed them. He pushed north, convinced escalation would force resolution. China entered the war with massive force. Front lines collapsed, casualties surged, strategic objectives reversed. The decision wasn't ignorance, it was certainty without constraint. The idiocy was not aggression, it was assuming momentum replaces analysis. 39. The moment Volkswagen decided cheating was cheaper than compliance. Emissions standards tightened. Engineering solutions were expensive. Executives chose software designed to detect tests and cheat them. Warnings existed. Engineers knew the risk. Sales grew. For years, it worked. Then, detection happened. Fines followed. Trust evaporated. Billions were lost. The idiocy was not ambition. It was assuming secrecy scales indefinitely. 40. The moment United Kingdom government decided slogans could replace scenarios. The Brexit referendum promised control and simplicity. Detailed planning lagged, trade-offs were minimized, warnings about supply chains, borders, and regulation were dismissed as pessimism. Negotiations revealed complexity. Deadlines slipped. Costs rose. Benefits remained abstract. The idiocy was not leaving. It was choosing certainty in slogans, and discovering reality requires spreadsheets. 41. The moment Saddam Hussein decided the world would bluff forever. By 1990, Saddam Hussein was not operating in an information vacuum. Intelligence briefings existed. Diplomatic signals were mixed but readable. Economic pressure was mounting. He had just emerged from a long war with Iran and was financially strained. Kuwait, small and oil-rich, looked tempting. Warnings existed. Advisors cautioned about international response. The United States issued ambiguous signals. Not approval, but not deterrence either. Saddam interpreted silence as permission. He assumed the global response would be rhetorical, not military. He invaded Kuwait. The escalation was immediate. International coalitions formed with speed Saddam did not anticipate. Sanctions followed. Military buildup followed. Diplomacy narrowed. When war came, it was overwhelming. Iraqi forces were pushed out. Infrastructure was destroyed. Sanctions crippled the country for years. Saddam remained in power temporarily, but permanently weakened. The invasion became the justification for decades of conflict, culminating in regime collapse and his execution. The idiocy was not ambition. It was mistaking diplomatic ambiguity for indifference and assuming hesitation equals weakness. 42. The moment Elizabeth Holmes decided confidence could replace functioning technology. Theranos promised a revolution in blood testing. Investors were impressed. Boards were stacked with power. Marketing surged. Inside the company, engineers warned repeatedly. The technology didn't work. Instead of slowing down, leadership escalated. Demonstrations were staged. Data was concealed. Whistleblowers were threatened. Each warning was treated as a loyalty problem rather than a technical one. The company expanded partnerships, putting real patients at risk. Investigations followed. The illusion collapsed. Billions vanished. Holmes was convicted. The idiocy was not ambition. It was scaling belief faster than truth. 43. The moment Imperial Japanese leadership decided complexity was secrecy. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, Japan devised an elaborate plan to lure U.S. forces into a trap. The plan involved multiple fleets, strict timing, and perfect coordination. Warnings existed. Complexity increases failure points. American code breakers anticipated the attack. Japanese forces were spread thin. When execution faltered, there was no flexibility. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers. Strategic momentum shifted permanently. The idiocy was not planning. It was mistaking complexity for intelligence. 44. The moment Nokia decided internal comfort mattered more than adaptation. Nokia dominated mobile phones. Smartphones emerged. Engineers warned leadership. Software teams flagged issues. Leadership hesitated, protecting existing structures and politics. Apple and Android moved fast. Nokia reorganized slowly. Market share evaporated. The company sold its phone division. The idiocy was not missing innovation. It was protecting internal peace at the cost of relevance. 45. The moment Gorbachev hardliners decided force could reverse time. In 1991, Soviet hardliners attempted a coup to stop reforms. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Media was censored. The assumption was fear would restore control. Instead, resistance unified. The coup collapsed within days. The Soviet Union dissolved shortly after. The idiocy was not fear of change. It was believing coercion can rewind history. By the time these 45 decisions are laid out, one thing becomes clear. History isn't shaped by stupidity in general. It's shaped by moments when people with power, information, and time chose confidence over correction. None of these outcomes required bad luck. None of them depended on mystery. In almost every case, warnings existed early, clearly, and repeatedly. What failed was not intelligence, it was restraint. Again and again, the pattern repeats. Early signs are dismissed, advisors are ignored, alternatives are postponed. Each decision narrows the path forward until there is no path left. At that point, the outcome looks inevitable, but only because all the exits were closed deliberately. These weren't accidents that came out of nowhere. They were processes, small choices stacked on top of each other, protected by authority, optimism, habit, or fear of looking weak. When collapse finally arrived, it didn't surprise anyone who had been paying attention. It only surprised the people in charge. History doesn't preserve these moments to mock intelligence. It preserves them because they're instructive in a quieter way. Not as lessons, not as warnings, but as records of how easily decision-making breaks when confidence goes unchecked. The people involved didn't think they were making history. They thought they were being decisive, efficient, bold, reasonable. The damage came later. Long after the meetings ended, the papers were signed, and the moment to reverse course had passed. And that's where this file closes. Not with condemnation, not with wisdom, but with a consistent pattern written across centuries. The most expensive mistakes in history are rarely made by fools. They're made by people who were certain they couldn't be wrong.